In life, there is but one certainty, which is that one day it will come to an end. This idea has simultaneously fascinated and scared the shit out of me for basically all my life, and I don't think I'm alone in that fear. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is a movie that encapsulates this fear in a way that is weirdly unique. Often enough we see heroes be afraid before battle until they ultimately overcome that fear and become their most powerful self. But rarely does this fear come from the embodiment of death itself. The Last Wish, along with some other stories I'll talk about today, try to tackle this fear in the most literal sense possible. One such example is the character Xande from the game Final Fantasy III. The 3D remake, that is. They made like 3 versions of this game with slight tweaks to characters and stories for some reason. Xande is the big villain of the game, but we only really get information about his character through other people, and the short boss fight we have with him at the end of the game. Through these interactions, we learn that he and 2 others were students of the great magus Noah, who upon dying bestowed them with 3 different gifts. The students Doga and Unai received his magic and control over the dream space respectively, but Xande received the gift of human mortality. Xande doesn't see this as a gift though, and in the original game and in the Pixel remaster, this enrages him so much he tries to plunge the world into darkness. The 3D remake though adds a bit more depth to his character, as he doesn't just want to sink the world into darkness, but rather he wants to stop the flow of time, so he no longer has to face death. In this version of the story, it angers him massively, and in that anger he tries to avoid his mortality, freezing time to put his life on pause permanently. This reflects the first 2 stages of grief, in denial and anger. For those unfamiliar, the 5 stages of grief were originally made to show different ways of coping with terminal illnesses and the death that comes with. But the model has since also been used as a more general look at grief, or in the case of this video, I will use it to look at how people cope with the more general idea of death. The first stage of grief is denial, a stage in which individuals cling to false hopes and realities as they try to deny the truth. The second stage is anger, which I don't think I have to explain. Xande doesn't want to accept his fate, and in his anger he tries to deny the inevitable, refusing the gift of his late teacher. The idea of everything ending scares him so badly he would rather be frozen in time for eternity than be confronted with the mortality that now belongs to him. This is all we really know about Xande, but even with that little bit of information, we can find similarities in how he and Puss react to the news of their mortality. Because while Xande was actually immortal at some point, Puss in Boots is a fairy tale cat and thus has 9 lives, and he practically believes that he is immortal. The movie opens with him incredibly cocky as he defeats a giant, all the while singing a song about him being fearless and having never been touched by a blade. This eventually causes him to get dogged and receiving the news from the doctor that he only has 1 life left. His initial reaction once again mirrors that of the first stage of grief, as he denies his mortality, stating that he laughs in the face of death, shrugging off the advice of retiring into a lap cat and going for a drink at the bar. But rather than Puss getting stuck in denial like Xande, Puss then meets death. Although he doesn't quite realize it yet. Puss thinks the wolf is a bounty hunter, but as he tries to fight him, Puss gets scraped by the sickle of death, drawing blood from his forehead. This is what makes him realize he is not actually invincible, and as the blood slowly trickles down in front of his eyes, everything slows down, and all that reflects in Puss's eyes is death. The realization that he's mortal finally hits, and with that realization comes a feeling of pure panic. The hairs on his skin stand upright, his heart is beating at the speed of light, his previous lives flash before his eyes, and as the wolf is telling him to pick up his sword, Puss can't take it anymore. He decides to flee and retire the Puss in Boots persona, following the doctor's advice to become a lap cat, a life that can only be described as a state of depression, the 4th stage of grief. It's important to note that the 5 stages of grief do not come linear. Even though they are usually shown as numbered stages, they don't have to come in this specific order. Grief is different for everyone and people cope at their own pace in their own ways. We can see this non-linear grieving process with Puss going from denial into depression, skipping the stages of anger and bargaining. The depression stage is defined by feelings of sadness and hopelessness, which we see Puss embody in his retirement as he settles down in his new life, doing absolutely nothing all day except to reminisce about the legend of Puss in Boots, sleep and be sad. The soundtrack sings that this is the end, and we see Puss quite literally bury himself, having to give up everything that made him such a legend. This would be forever and make for an incredibly boring movie if it wasn't for the wishing star. The thing that pulls Puss out of his depression is the promise of the wishing star, which fell from the sky many a year ago and can grant a single wish to the first person that gets to it. Puss sees this as an opportunity to get all of his 9 lives back and return to his ways as the Puss in Boots. This marks the beginning of the bargaining stage of grief, a phase where people attempt to negotiate their way out of loss, or in this case, mortality. This is often tried by making deals with themselves or higher powers to avoid the inevitable. For Puss, this bargaining takes the form of the search for the wishing star. He desperately wants to believe that a single wish can outdo his mortality. Although it might sound silly, coping with deaths in more unusual ways, like searching for a wishing star, is something that goes back to some of the roots of human storytelling. A great example of this is the Greek myth of Sisyphus. Now, you might be familiar with him from his story or from this image that was a big meme about a year and a half ago, but in case you never heard of him, and I'm going to simplify the story a lot here, in Greek mythology, Sisyphus was a tyrant of the city Corinth. He killed visitors for fun, married his niece, and overall was a giant dickhead. In fact, his actions angered the gods so much that Zeus sent Thanatos, the personification of death, to take Sisyphus to the underworld. But as the story goes, Sisyphus was an incredibly clever man, and when Thanatos brought the chains to take him away, Sisyphus managed to trick him into putting the chains on himself. Sisyphus escaped death through this trickery, but with the personification of death died up, everyone stopped dying. This angered Ares, the god of war, because none of his opponents were dying, and he personally freed Thanatos, setting him free and once again sending him after Sisyphus. But Sisyphus had one more trick up his sleeve. Before he dies, he asks his wife, when the day comes, to throw his naked corpse in the middle of the public square. So when he arrives in the underworld, he managed to convince Persephone, the queen of the underworld, to let him go back to the world of the living, only to scold his wife for disrespecting him after his death, and then return to the underworld. Sisyphus, of course, does not return to the underworld. Rather, he enjoys his life, having avoided death once again. But eventually, it has to come to an end, and he gets dragged back to the underworld by Hermes, the god of too many things to name here, and this time there's no escape. His punishment for trying to outsmart the gods is to roll a boulder up a hill, but every time he gets close to the top, it will roll all the way back down, dooming him to a fate of eternal futility. Sisyphus' eternal futility is a source of hope for people even now, his inability to escape not withholding his attempt to do so. His search for life mirrors that of Puss, who we see spring back to life with the hopeful promise that he can regain meaning. The start of this stage marks a turning point for the movie, as it takes on a seemingly more light-hearted tone, the search for the wishing star looking to be a fun adventure. But every so often, Puss hears this menacing whistle, and death shows up. These scenes are few and far between, but they create this unsettling atmosphere where, even through the fun shenanigans, we feel the presence in the back of our mind. There are other villains in the story, but none of them even feel like a threat compared to Death himself. And it again puts us into the mindset of Puss as he is constantly reminded of his own mortality. Death's scarce screen time also makes the scenes where he does show all the more intense. like when Puss meets the spirit of his previous 8 lives, and after learning some important life lessons, Death appears and starts smashing his previous lives, which is the actual scene where he reveals that, in no fancy ways, he is Death. This scene sends Puss into a panic again, and when he runs away, he stumbles upon the star. Still believing that he needs to be, or at least feel immortal to return to his previous life, he prepares to wish back the 8 lives previously lost. That is really what this is all about. He wants to go back to when he felt like death couldn't take him. He believes that he has to be immortal just to be able to live. But this is where his travel mates Perito and Kitty Softpaws come in. And although I haven't talked about them at all, they are perhaps most important in making Puss realize he doesn't need his wish. They convince him that his life is worth protecting and that it's precious, not because it's infinite, but because one day it will come to an end. He doesn't completely overcome his fear as shown in the visuals. Death is still incredibly scary and intimidating. But in accepting the inevitability, it makes Death back off. Not as an enemy that he beat, but as something that no longer haunts Puss's mind. And that's where Puss in Boots' story ends, as he finally manages to accept his mortality, having gone through the denial, depression, and bargaining stages to eventually accept death and find meaning in the impermanence of life. Although these stories come from wildly different times and mediums, ranging from a classic JRPG to Greek mythology to a animated DreamWorks movie about a cat who wears cool boots. At their core, they present this fundamental fear, showing how these completely different characters try to cope with the inevitable. We see Xande, blinded by rage, try to deny his mortality, freezing time not to make him live forever, but rather to stop him from dying. He was not able to find enough value in his life to make the eventual end worth it. We initially see a similar sentiment in Puss, who denies his mortality by believing he cannot die, but after he realizes he's nearing his end, decides that his life isn't worth truly living anymore, as he enters a stage of depression. Sisyphus is a bit more unique in this way. He too denies his mortality, but it comes more from a place of him giving too much value to life, as he refuses to let death take him easily, only going down kicking and screaming. With these themes, it's not too surprising that there are interpretations of his story where his eternal punishment was actually more of an impossible quest set by Hades, where if he succeeded in pushing the boulder up the hill, he would be able to return to the upper world with immortality. This is how it's written in the book Mythos by Stephen Fry, and is also how I first learned about his story. And though not canonical to the original Greek myth, I think it quite perfectly represents how Sisyphus' story has grown to be a beacon of hope and human perseverance. But really, what's the point of all this? In real life, no one is stopping time to prevent themselves from dying. There's no personification of death that we can chain or fight, or play chess with. In real life, death just happens. And whether you believe in an afterlife or in nothingness or in anything in between, death will happen all the same. But Puss in Boots, Sisyphus, and even Xande for that matter, share this fear, which although represented abstractly, is so incredibly human. And for 14-year-old me watching Puss in Boots in the theaters, this was a feeling that I recognized quite well. Because watching this movie brought me back into a time a few months before that, unable to sleep as my thoughts would be stuck loitering on everything that could possibly come after death. I wasn't afraid of the act of dying as much as what came after it, eternal nothingness somehow not being the worst my brain could come up with. After a week or two, I mostly stopped thinking about it and returned to my regular dose of sleep deprivation. But every so often it would peek its head around the corner. Conversations around death quickly made me scared and uncomfortable. Watching that movie, however, and in turn relating to Puss in Boots as he progressed through this shared fear, helped me realize that yes, death is incredibly scary. But that doesn't mean you have to give up the opportunity to live. I'm 16 now, I'm still a child, and death is still incredibly scary to me. But in the last 2 years, I've also found myself coming back to think about death over and over again. Whether it be in learning about philosophy, in some of the incredibly grim media I have consumed, or even just while living life. It has grown into this almost morbid fascination that culminated into me making this video right now. Ultimately, all of these stories show different reactions and realities to death. In the end, I decided to mostly focus this video on The Last Wish, because it dares to expose the entirety of this fear. So we see Puss in his highest highs and his lowest low. And all the while, it manages to be an amazing movie outside of that fear as well. I think that's pretty awesome. I've been Shilsey, and thank you so much for watching.